Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I want to thank everybody who's dialed in for this great program that we have lined up today. My name is Brent Fewell. I'm with ConservAmerica, and I am delighted to be moderating today's webinar. On January 27th, President Biden issued an executive order titled Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. Among other things, the order set out an ambitious goal of conserving 30% of our nation's lands and waters by 2030. This initiative is also known as 30 by 30. While the initiative has strong support amongst many conservation groups, it has raised concern by others. How is conservation to be measured? What metrics will be used to measure success? What role will states, tribes, and local governments play in the process? What about sportsmen and landowners? Is there a role for market-based solutions? We have an all-star lineup today who will help us answer those questions. But before I introduce our panelists, a quick word about ConservAmerica for those who may be unfamiliar with us. ConservAmerica is a conservation organization dedicated to promoting pragmatic solutions to our nation's energy, environmental, and conservation challenges, advocating for market-based solutions and meaningful, sustainable regulatory reform. Today's webinar is part of our monthly webinar series aimed at promoting impactful engagement on important policy issues affecting our shared environment. I am grateful, and we are fortunate today to have Collin O'Mara, President of the National Wildlife Federation, Brian Yablonski, the CEO for Property and Environment Research Center, also known as PERC, and Lynn Scarlett, Chief External Affairs Officer for the Nature Conservancy, join us today. I've had the pleasure of working with each of them for a number of years, and I consider each a friend and prominent voice in the world of environment and conservation policy. Each of our panelists have agreed to offer 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks and thoughts on 30 by 30. We'll then move into a Q&A where those of you who have dialed in can send in your questions via the chat function. So after a flip of the coin, Collin has agreed to kick off today's discussion, followed by Lynn and then Brian. Thank you, Collin. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Brian. It's great to be with you and Brian and Lynn, of course. This is an exciting conversation, right? I mean, this is a conversation where, for the first time, I think there's a level of national ambition for conservation at scale. And at the same time, as Brett teed up, we're at a moment where, because of some of the battles of the past, because of, uncertainty and the present anxiety in general, we have an opportunity to design the system that we want to see in the future. And I think one of the themes that you're going to hear from me over the course of the next hour is that, if this is an exercise simply around, mapping and lines on maps, we will have failed. If it's an exercise around restoration, around increasing ecological productivity, it's about connectivity. If it's about kind of increasing, carbon sinks and, really kind of restoring wildlife populations, the opportunities for collaboration are frankly some of the greatest that any of us will have seen in our lifetime. And I think, hopefully that from the National Wildlife Federation's point of view, at least, is that we want to see that this is a framework that's really built on collaboration, good, proactive, on the ground, collaboration, bringing people together to do big things like I think all of our organizations want to do. Now, if it starts feeling like it's regulatory and restrictive and preventing different activities, I think unfortunately some of the more traditional battle lines will kind of reemerge, and we'll potentially miss some of the greater opportunities. And so I wanted to share a little bit about how we're thinking about it at the National Wildlife Federation. Our leading scientist, Bruce Stein, who many of you know well, has been giving this a lot of thought about how to both get the ecology right, but also kind of the human dimension right. Because I do think we're in the moment, just as Brent teed up in the open, where there's folks that like to hunt and fish. There's folks that are ranching or farming or managing forests that want to know how does it affect them. And I'm hoping today, at least through my comments, and I'm sure Lynn's and Brian's as well, to hopefully allay some of those fears for how some of our organizations are thinking and advocating about this, because there's so much opportunity. I mean, you look at the state of habitat in this country, and it's it's pretty degraded in a lot of places. I mean, we've protected some special places in this country, but in general, conservation at the beginning of the last century, even through the most of the past 100 years, has been fairly place-based, not so much thinking about connectivity, not thinking so much about migration, not thinking necessarily about how ecosystems and landscapes fit together. Now that's changed dramatically in the last 15, 20 years. And obviously we're moving in that direction. But the idea of kind of getting to scale and having habitat that's improved all over the country on working lands, on conservation lands, on public lands, on private lands alike, is a huge opportunity. And I think, the ability to bring in new capital to do this, a way to build outdoor recreation economies, strengthen rural economies, as ways to really make sure that there are opportunities created in some places, frankly, that have been left behind historically in our economy, but also places that are hit incredibly hard during the COVID crisis. Particularly communities that maybe have depended on extraction in the past, or communities that depended on tourism. I mean, obviously, two of the sectors that have been bigger hit in the crisis. And so, for us, I mean, there are a few principles that kind of come to mind that we think should be part of the conversation in a significant way. And I just like to run through a few of them with you, as I'm sure we'll get into this more in the conversation. But the first and foremost is we want to make sure that it really is a kind of a representative effort, that we're really trying to conserve habitat in every kind of corner of the country for all different types of ecosystems. I mean, a lot of the public lands in this country are more Western, right? I mean, a lot of the red rock country, and these are incredibly important areas. But the Southeast forests have a much fewer places that are kind of more formally protected. That a lot of those in private hands and private landowners. How do we make sure we work with folks to improve the ecological productivity in some of those places that haven't typically had the federal overlay? And I'm not proposing that we do, but how do we make sure that different types of ecosystems in different parts of the country are part of this? And in the line that Bruce gave me the other day was kind of thinking of it like Noah's Ark, right? You kind of want that 2x2 of all species, making sure we're conserving the full diversity of wildlife. And a good place to start with this is the state wildlife action plans. You got about 12,000 species of greatest conservation need, in addition to this, which includes most of the 1,600 plants and animal species that are already listed under the Endangered Species Act. But what better way to try to conserve and restore their habitat by then focusing on the ecosystems that are most in trouble, and really trying to be representative of the entire country. And one of the complementary efforts that I'm sure I'll work into this about a dozen times in this presentation is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which would actually proactively fund a lot of that conservation work. We also want to make sure that the initiative focuses on resilience, making sure that ecosystems and species can persist over time, and that we're kind of managing into the change, knowing what we're seeing from climate impacts, from temperature zones changing, increased storms, increased fires, greater precipitation. Now, how do we make sure that resilience is built into how we're thinking about 30 by 30 in a big way? And this is where we're so grateful for our partnership with the Nature Conservancy. It's been doing a lot of leading thinking on this for years. We also want to talk about connectivity and making sure that at a time when habitat is increasingly fragmented or dissected, bisected, that we're connecting habitat. And this is where the bipartisan work around corridors and around crossings is so important. I mean, the fact that one of the bigger conservation achievements of the last administration was their focus on connectivity. We think we can enhance that and have 30 by 30 be a way to connect habitats that frankly we need to restore as a way to improve migration, and particularly as we're seeing shifts in the in populations and in greater climate changes. We also want to make sure we're focusing on hotspots. I mentioned, kind of the Southeast forests where we have issues with, freshwater mussels and, crayfish and a whole range of biodiversity challenges on some of the islands, and whether that's Hawaii or some of the territories, huge biodiversity challenges. And so kind of locking in on places where with great collaborative work and focus, we can really save the full amazing biodiversity that spans this incredible continent. We want to think about ecological services and think about the way that different types of ecosystems provide clean water and drought resilience and flood abatement. I mean, all these additional values, in addition to the carbon values that they can provide, huge opportunities to have multiple benefits that can serve, many needs that we have, and frankly, do it in ways that are often cheaper than having to clean up water through wastewater plants or other types of man-made engineered infrastructure. And also trying to think through how we keep intact ecological processes together, and because we've altered a lot of systems around the world and frankly around the country, and the ability to kind of sustain those great places that we have and build on them is really, really important. On the climate front, we do have a few things that, kind of thinking about adaptation and resilience. I've talked a little bit about this, but, really thinking through how we, kind of are conserving and restoring lands for the next 100 years, for the next 200 years, and not just kind of trying to put back what was, decades ago, but really being forward thinking, kind of skating where the puck is going as opposed to where it used to be, to use the old great Gretzkyism. Thinking about thinking about some of the opportunities around carbon, kind of existing carbon strongholds, as well as places where with some restoration we could sequester more and have greater natural solutions be part of the overall balance as we're trying to move towards net zero in the decades ahead. And all of this we think we can do through a very collaborative frame that we're engaging folks in every community across the country in very collaborative ways, moving beyond just protected areas, but to conservation and restoration. On tribal lands, on public lands, on private lands, on different types of ownership, but really building on the collaborative efforts. I mean, there's great efforts, the state wildlife action plans, through regional conservation plans, through the various ecosystem level kind of scale plans, a lot of opportunities. And this will bring me to my very last point before I turn it back over to Brent. The infrastructure package that we're talking about right now, already has about $80 billion worth of natural infrastructure kind of in it. We think that we can do even better than that. Could be the greatest down payment towards improving the ecological functions of lands all across the country, and a down payment towards 30 by 30 that we've ever experienced in our country. I mean, the amount of work that everyone on this call did over the last couple of years to get the Great American Outdoors Act was magnificent and a huge conservation victory. It is dwarfed by the scale of opportunity that they're talking about potentially through investments in restoration, resilience, reclamation in the infrastructure package. So I'm sure we'll get more into that, but there's a huge opportunity to do this work and achieve these goals through collaboration and partnerships, and does not have to be yet another kind of regulatory fear that folks face given all the economic challenges that we're facing. Brent?
Thank you, Collin. Lynn, Collin raises some good points. In the West, there's lots of public lands, but in the Southeast and east of the Mississippi, there really aren't. So I'd love to hear your thoughts too in your opening remarks about, the importance of private landowners and how the role of land ownership, private landowners can help achieve this conservation goal. So.
Thanks, Brent, and lots of common themes with Collin. I'm really delighted to join this incredibly timely conversation. I spent, as some of you know, 8 years in the G.W. Bush administration, including 4 years as the Deputy Secretary and even a brief time as the Acting Secretary. And during those years, we celebrated the potential of what we called cooperative conservation and collaboration across large landscapes and watersheds and ocean. And now at the Nature Conservancy, as we pursue conservation, we embrace that central role of collaboration, that theme you heard Collin talk about a lot, and including, especially in conservation partnerships with landowners and many, many others. Conservation, it's important to remind ourselves, is not just nice, it's essential. It's essential for thriving communities, dynamic economies, and healthy lands, water, and wildlife. The fundamental interconnections of people, health, nature, communities, and economies, I think, really underlie the vision of 30 by 30. Think about the challenges. Collin mentioned some of them. They're complex. The pace of change quickens. Climate change and its effects on land, water, wildlife, and people are vast and varied, and they're impacting agriculture, fisheries, forests, communities, cities, towns across the country. Invasive weeds, water quality and supply challenges, the ravages of catastrophic wildland fire, and more, all of those challenge us in the here and now. And so we need ambitious, science-informed, equitable, coordinated, and collaborative conservation to sustain lands, waters, wildlife that really underpin our well-being. So consider that nature itself has significant potential in the US to sequester carbon. We estimate at the Conservancy that as much as 20% of emission storage needed to be on track to address climate change can occur through nature. Farms and forests are part of that equation. That's why over 70 agricultural organizations have formed the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance to contribute to solutions. Think about resilience, something that Collin also mentioned. Enhancing resilience of communities also requires collaborative conservation and at large scales. Think about the increased frequency of high intensity storms with coastal and river flooding, increased risks of catastrophic wildland fire, impacts on agriculture, pollination, water availability, the list goes on. None of those can be addressed without collaboration. And nature is a big part of the solution. For example, through coastal wetlands and reef restoration to reduce risks to communities from storms. So how can we think about 30 by 30 given that backdrop? Meaningful contributions to a 30 by 30 aspiration require broad action by public and private sectors, habitat conservation, restoration, reforestation, improved forest management, fisheries management, coastal system restoration. Now, of course, a key question is which natural systems are key. And that 30%, as Collin noted, needs to be representative, resilient, effectively managed, needs to be durable. Some locations are likely to be much more resilient than others to stressors like climate change or disturbances, and we need to think about those. We need to consider how those can be in the mix. The Conservancy's resilience and connected network tool actually helps us identify places that will survive climate changes and can maybe help contribute to abating climate effects and save biodiversity at the same time. But along with protecting biodiversity, those resilient lands also support human communities. They provide fresh water, outdoor industry jobs, many other benefits. But as Collin really emphasized, and as Brent's opening remarks suggested, how we engage is as important as what we conserve. We must engage state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, agriculture and forest landowners, fishers, and other stakeholders to shape the strategies for achieving a 30 by 30 goal using many conservation approaches. Success requires deploying a full suite of conservation tools. Yes, traditional approaches like parks and refuges are important, but conservation tools also include sustainable resource management and public policies and funding to support those efforts. They include support for conservation and management efforts of Indigenous peoples to ensure that they can continue their traditional ways of life, including customary hunting, fishing, and gathering practices. We have many tools like the conservation title of the Farm Bill, the Forest Legacy Program. Collin mentioned the Land and Water Conservation Fund, support for conservation easements, conservation banking, conservation certification programs, and more. All of those are tools, Brent, that play out in concert with landowners. Collaboration with ranchers, farmers, fishers, hunters, tribes, and others is essential to shaping the vision, defining the doable, and pinpointing possibilities. The good news is that collaborative conservation is a centerpiece of much 21st century conservation, and we need to build on those efforts and experiences. The Conservancy looks forward to strengthening collaborative processes and the application of science. You know, when I served at the US Department of the Interior, I was privileged to meet with folks along the Duck Trap River in Maine, Winyah Bay in North Carolina, Los Cienegos in Arizona, the Swan Valley in Montana, the Uncompahgre Plateau in Colorado, and so many other places. And all the people I met were clustered in constellations of action to conserve places and enhance communities. And therein lies my optimism for the 30 by 30 framework. How can such efforts be built into that 30 by 30 vision? What funding, plans, commitments, tools, such as conservation easements and other enduring efforts, can help us conserve a medley of resilient, representative, interconnected, as Collin noted, lands, waters, and ocean? Collaborative processes are as important as substance in defining the challenges and assembling and communicating information, identifying options, and settling on courses of action. I like to think nature unites us. We can build upon that unity. And I'll end just by recounting a little tale. A couple of years ago, I hiked a stretch of trail in Glacier National Park and then hiked a stretch into Waterton National Park across the US border. And I savored the magnificence of those two places, vistas of mountains, glacial lakes, wetlands rich in wildlife, meadows of magnificent wildflowers. It was spring. I tasted berries, plump and perfumed. I saw grizzlies. Thankfully, they were far off across the way. And I celebrate the significance of those places. But what I also really celebrate are partnerships among people, organizations, and governments, those who lend caring hands to these places and give meaning to communities. After my hikes, I visited ranchers, firefighters, bear biologists, community leaders, First Nation peoples, and these were people whose lives and livelihoods were tightly linked to lands and waters in those regions. These people are collaborating in conservation, in restoration, in shared efforts that I think exemplify what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. Their efforts exemplify our capacity for civility, for respect, for problem solving. And of course, those efforts are not easy, but they're efflorescing across the nation. And the 30 by 30 aspiration provides a platform to realize a vision of conserving lands and waters on which all life depends. Thank you.
Lynn, thank you. And I particularly appreciate your emphasis on collaboration, and you reminded me of the Cooperative Conservation Initiative, and I was at EPA with Ben Grumbles at the time, and it was a great initiative, and there's still a lot of good things that have come out. And I remember the collaboration between Trout Unlimited, Chris Wood coming to EPA and saying, "Can you help us? Can the government help get the legal barriers out of our way so we can go in and clean up this impacted trout stream impacted by acid mine drainage and a legacy?" And we were able to do that. And to this day, there's been a lot of great work that's come out of the collaboration between government and landowners and civil society. So I'm hopeful that we can continue to build upon those successes. So thank you for that. Brian, what say you today?
Hey there, bud. Good to be here, Brent. Thank you for having me, and Collin and Lynn. Great honor to be on the panel with you. Appreciate you both, and good to see you. And welcome to everybody out there who's tuned in. So my perspective on this is that 30 by 30 is certainly, in the words of Jim Collins, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And that's a good thing. Big goals can be good things. They can be aspirational, as Lynn said, and this is certainly an aspirational view here. But to summon the ghost of Donald Rumsfeld, there's a lot of unknown unknowns at this point, and still a lot to sort out. I'm not sure we'll sort it out today here in this panel, but I do know, I think, on April 27th, if I'm not mistaken, we'll have a 90-day report on this from the administration. They were given 90 days to look at this. And I wouldn't expect a huge amount of detail coming out of that. I think the Department of the Interior is probably likely to lay out principles and processes for moving forward and for an engagement. And that's not all a bad thing. Landowners and ranchers and farmers, foresters, sportsmen all want to have meaningful input here, and that just doesn't happen in 90 days. So I think the administration needs time to have this play out some. It's probably, where I come from is more of coach than critic at this point as they're moving forward on this. The biggest unknown at this point is what conservation counts towards the 30%. And spoiler alert, we're not going to decide that today, but I'm not even sure there's a consensus on the baseline. According to the USGS, 12% of the land in America today is protected. But I've seen other folks saying, well, maybe the baseline's a little bit higher than that. So they're going to have to sort through that. If you take the 12% number and we've got to get an additional 18%, that's 440 million acres of land. And to give you some sense of scale, that's 4 times the state of California. So that's a pretty tall order. And inevitably, and one of the reasons we're all here today is that it's going to involve private lands to get to that number. So I really had 3 observations on 30 by 30 that I wanted to share, and then 4 short recommendations. So this is my 3 by 4 initiative. If I only had 2 observations, it would be a 2 by 4 initiative, which I thought would have been pretty cool, but I had 3. So, but here are as far as the observations go. So here's number 1, done right, private land stewardship is really the next frontier in conservation, I believe. And private lands are where there's abundant wildlife, we've got clean water, we've got vast open space. Consider that 75% of our nation's wetlands are on private lands, 80% of our grasslands are on private lands, and 2/3 of all threatened and endangered species depend on private land for the majority of their habitat. And that's not accidental. That tracks with human settlement. People settled the best lands, not the craggy, frozen high country of rock and ice, to borrow from my friend Whitney Tilt, but the lush, fertile valleys with water is where they ended up settling. And so we have lots of private land. We have close to 900 million acres of ranches and farms out there, 450 million acres of private forests. So I think the biggest conservation gains will be done there, but done right. It's got to be done right. And private landowners know all this, and there's part nervousness, but maybe there's part also a sense of opportunity that could come from this too, if done right. So that's the first observation. My second observation is that words matter. And I have a feeling the words in the executive order were selected very carefully. So section 216 of the executive order talks about conserving 30% of our nation's land and waters. It doesn't say protecting, and it doesn't say preserving, which might be too limiting in how we think about this. So conserving envisions multiple and sustainable use. There's an interesting study by Robert Bonney, who a lot of us know when he was at the Duke Nicholas Institute, on understanding rural attitudes towards the environment and conservation. And Robert found in that study that rural Americans who rely on the environment for their livelihoods focus on conserving resources and their sustainable use. But interestingly, those same rural Americans also think that urban Americans put a priority on preservation and protection that prevents use. So words matter, and words are going to matter going forward in terms of how we're dealing with private lands. The third observation I have is how we think about large-scale conservation is very 20th century right now. When people think of conservation, they think of public lands or of private lands legally constrained by easements. And both have been effective tools through the history of conservation. But I think conservation needs a redefinition, and not to simply hitch itself to the tools that people are used to. So we should think more expansively about conservation. We probably need a 21st century model, not a 20th century model. And, you know, I think to some extent, I think the current definitions of conservation lack a little bit of imagination and exclude much of the good that's out there. Most important, and one of my big bugaboos, is that you know, the focus should be on how lands are managed and not what land is called. So there's this great swath, you know, living out here in Montana, we see this great swath of rural America that manages private lands as good and likely, if not better, than the federal and state government. But that land doesn't count in our book as conservation. It doesn't count because it's not public land. It doesn't count because it's not in a government program that takes taxpayer dollars, or it doesn't count because it's not enrolled as an easement. So, you know, why do we treat these landowners' stewardship as invisible just because they don't fit neatly in the box that we've created as conservationists? So I think we should find ways to make that kind of management, that kind of stewardship count. Otherwise, our failure to be creative in this world is going to lead to working lands not working anymore and to more development and fragmentation at the end of the day. So with those three observations, you know, my four sort of short recommendations for the administration going forward on 30 by 30 would be, you know, first, you know, as it relates to private lands, and this sort of echoes something that Collin said, the administration should come out strongly against the use of regulations or restrictive designations to reach the 30 by 30 target. So don't let the vacuum of silence get filled by bad thoughts out there. Don't let the landowners go to a dark place here. You know, say it this clearly, say 30 by 30 need not and must not infringe on private property rights. And you would think that's coming from PERC, right? PERC said that. Yeah. Actually, that came from the Center for American Progress, word for word. So this one should be easy for the administration to do. Yeah. Number two, you know, show that there's an opportunity for the private landowner. Connect the environment with economics. So conservation is most effective when it makes economic sense to those who we want to do the conserving. And that will mean voluntary incentives, market-based tools, collaboration, like, you know, Lynn and Collin have said there. You know, think about habitat leasing, you know, where businesses might pay for mitigation for environmental impacts they might have. Think about estate tax benefits that would be really important to working landowners. Think about improved regulatory relief. Like regulation, you know, is somewhat of a currency. It's costly. It's a negative currency to landowners, and less of it should be provided for good management that landowners do. And that's not always the case. You know, we look at the Endangered Species Act, and sometimes it doesn't reward for improvement. And then number three, the messenger matters here. We should avoid top-down approaches and environmental colonialism, where federal government environmental groups are dictating to rural communities and to private landowners what's best for them. You know, in rural communities, and this was Robert Bonney's study also, only about 25% of the people believe the federal government, rather than the state, should lead on the environment. And only 13% of rural America trusts environmental groups as sources of information for conservation issues. That was like dead last among all the sources of information. So as conservation organizations, we need to know that going in. And then fourth and finally, I'd say that, nature, as everybody here on this panel knows, is fluid and messy and dynamic and not very static and geometric. And that's a good thing. And the conservation toolkit to get to 30% should probably mimic nature. The current toolkit we have might be inadequate. It can be divisive too. And we need an approach that like researchers like Holly Dormus and Arthur Middleton call a portfolio approach to conserving private lands. We need a big spectrum of options at the end of the day. Here at PERC, we work on private land conservation in the river valleys coming out of Yellowstone National Park. And, I've learned one thing in this work, and it's that every state, the 3 states around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, each state is different, and every river valley in each state is different, and every rancher in every river valley in each state is different. So what works for one landowner might not work for a neighboring landowner. And so we do need to have a broad toolkit of what can count. And I think, if those 4 things are done, I think there's a chance, this goal could be an opportunity for landowners rather than a liability for landowners. But it has to be done right. And as Lynn has said, and Collin, the engagement part is super important here. So.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
Those were great, great words of wisdom. Lynn, as you indicated, there's been some headlines, with among Republican lawmakers, some Republican lawmakers skeptical of 30 by 30 is a possible Trojan horse for greater government expansion of federal lands, possibly locking up natural resources on federal lands, whether it's fossil fuels or minerals. I mean, what is your advice to this administration on the balance? And there may be some cases where Antiquities Act is appropriate and a good tool to use, but in other cases there could be a potential rush to use some of these federal tools to lock up resources. Love your comments, thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to build on the comments that both Brian and Collin made.
Okay.
I love the word. I love the term portfolio. So, for an ambition like 30 by 30, we need a lot of tools in the toolkit, and including some that we have not yet envisioned, new tools in the toolkit. But there are places, of course, for refuges. Refuges are extraordinarily important, have been important. I'm a birder. I love going to our wildlife refuges. So all tools in the toolkit, but also what you've heard both Brian and Collin and myself say is the collaborative processes where we're all jointly sort of co-designing the opportunities are critically important. And you already see that in the language that the president has put out, that some of the architects of the vision have put forth. But let me give you a glimpse of some of the kinds of opportunities through 2 things that the current Conservancy has been involved in. One, in the Central Appalachians, there's a lot of not abandoned, reclaimed mine lands there. Mm-hmm. And they're essentially unproductive right now. They don't have economic use. We're looking at those, have evaluated them for potential of siting renewables on those reclaimed mine lands. And then in the surrounding lands, actually engaging in reforestation and then sustainable forest management, bringing outdoor recreation opportunities, renewable energy economic opportunities, carbon benefits from that reforestation, improved forest management and timber economy potential. So that kind of effort is pulling together what I described earlier: thriving communities, dynamic economies, healthy lands and waters, and in a way, yes, that could contribute to a vision of 30 by 30. Now, just what the baseline is and what counts and what exactly is the tool, I mean, that we need to think through, but we have the vision. Let me give you one more example. Penobscot River. Golly, it's an effort that's been underway for several decades, but communities up and down the Penobscot understood that there were some dams along that river that actually were no longer useful. They were created way back when, and contributed to energy in the effort in the area. But realized that also they had significantly interrupted connectivity of that river. And so the community came together, has taken out some of those dams and done so in a very collaborative way, where the utilities were all okay with it. They still had their energy production elsewhere, and indeed in more modernized facilities. There was connectivity and recreation opportunities. There's a lot more opportunities like that. It's not about regulation. It's about thinking smart, thinking about the now and the future, and generating those sorts of solutions that are good for people, economy, and communities, and wildlife.
Yep, great points, Lynn. And the Penobscot is a great example of a success story. And I sit 10 miles. It's for me where I sit here today. So it's a very productive river now. We got a lot of questions coming in. So let me, Christy writes, would you please touch upon your view of the role of governors in the states in helping to advance 30 by 30? Collin, you want to take that one?
Sure. No, thanks, Christy. I think for everybody, the role of the states and local governments is huge. Frankly, because I still think a lot of the place-based work and prioritization, is often best at the local level. And so we've already seen a series of governors do resolutions, proclamations. There's some state bills that are floating around. But I think it's encouraging that folks want to figure out what makes sense for them, and a lot of them are setting up very collaborative processes where they have broad stakeholder engagement. To try to figure out where are those places that make sense for investment, for restoration. And so I'm really heartened by that. I always like the old Lamar Alexander model, or the President Reagan, or the Ken Salazar model, kind of the Great American Outdoors Act, right? Where this idea where they put out these big ideas for what are the most important things in your state. I think that's where some of the best thinking could likely occur. I'd frankly rather have restoration priorities identified through things like state wildlife action plans and state forest action plans, and collaboratively develop conservation plans on the ground, than kind of try to be decided by someone looking at a map on a wall in Washington. So I would encourage anyone that's associated with governors to be proactive. I think if folks are saying, look, this is what it means for our state, these are the places we want to invest, these are the places we want to attract additional capital, these are the places we want to restore. I think that could be a game changer for the broader community.
Anyone else? Brian?
Yeah, no, I just add, the question that Christy offers is a good one. It has me thinking of the big game migration corridor secretarial order that came out a few years ago, and how the Department of the Interior did not say okay, these are the corridors, these are what you need to do. It was kind of, this is a priority. How can we be helpful? How can we provide technical assistance? And then it turned it over to the states to actually identify what the migration hotspots would be. So really at that point, it became a state-led thing to feed back to what the states might need to conserve these migration corridors. And I think that's probably the same kind of approach you need to do here.
Yep, agreed. Now there's been mixed response by sportsmen's groups, hunters, anglers, and Collin, I'm wondering what you're hearing. Obviously, they're concerned about perhaps greater limitations on access for hunting in certain areas and other, harvesting. What's your response and message back to those who are concerned in that community?
Yeah, I'm really grateful for the leadership of the Congressional Sportsman Foundation and Christie's with TRCP. They've been doing some great thinking on this. Like a lot of both the hunting groups and the angling groups, as you mentioned, have been kind of giving a lot of thought. And I think there's a bit of a fear, which is grounded in previous monument designations in some cases where folks lost hunting access, or at least had the fear of losing it. And so I just think being inclusive from the beginning. It was in California when a bill was going through the state legislature, some concerns were raised around access, and they weren't really addressed. And then the bill ended up going down in committee. Flash forward a few months, Governor Newsom was working on an executive order at the state level, was much more receptive to different types of traditional uses. And it was everything, right? It was the tribes wanted to make sure that traditional uses weren't impacted anyway. They wanted, like sportsmen and sportswomen wanted to make sure there's no loss of access, other types of users, just making sure that kind of sustainable, wise use was allowed. But I think it's the kind of thing where it's instead of kind of being concerned from the sidelines, let's get engaged. And that's why I think the Hunt Fish 3030 initiative that a lot of us have been involved in is important. I was kind of involved in some of the conversations that are underway right now in the administration around how they ensure that hunting and fishing kind of comes through in the report. And I can assure you that it's in very good shape. So I think that folks have learned the lessons of the past. I understand the frustrations that are still there from decisions from as recently as just a few years ago. But I think folks should be encouraged that access will be enhanced and not diminished through this initiative.
So Lynn, we've got a number of questions coming in about the oceans. We've talked a lot about terrestrial ecosystems, but where is there opportunity for conservation in the oceans?
I briefly mentioned in my opening remarks the importance certainly of coasts and especially coastal systems and resilience, but there are opportunities both in the broader ocean and then on coast. Let me speak first to coastal systems. We at the Conservancy have done a lot of research that suggests, for example, that oyster reefs, coral reefs, coastal sea marshes are very significant in wave attenuation and reducing storm surge, thereby protecting communities from property losses and damage from high intensity storms. And in fact, we did such a study in the Northeast after Hurricane Sandy, and we determined that those communities that had kept intact some of their coastal wetland systems actually avoided something on the order of $625 million in damage that otherwise would have occurred had those systems not been there. We're now working closely with the Army Corps of Engineers on what they call their engineering with nature framework to ask, gee, for those coastal systems, how can we invest in those systems, coastal sea marsh restoration, et cetera, and use those, yes, great biodiversity benefits, but also really significant economic opportunities. A lot of those systems are kind of fish nurseries or marine life nurseries, and they also protect communities from risks of storms and so forth. So along coast, there are those opportunities. Of course, in ocean systems, we do a lot of work with fishing community and on in fact, using some market type tools, working with fisheries communities on improved and sustainable fisheries management. I could very much envision those being part of, with clear sustainability goals built into them, part of a 30 by 30 vision. So yes, ocean critically important. By the way, I will say that for the US and the US ocean systems, because of some marine monuments, there's actually quite a bit of conservation of marine ocean space.
Yeah, very well
put. I would join in. It had me thinking, and I saw my friend Aaron Adams ask that question, and it's a good one. But it had me thinking of estuaries and wetlands in the Southeast, where I'm originally from, and it brings up the question of quantity over quality. And I know ConservAmerica has raised this issue too. Is the bogey here, we're focused on the metric of acres conserved, but coming from the Southeast, I can tell you like some of the highest biodiversity that's out there might be on smaller acreage that are in these estuaries and wetlands of the coastal plains that might not get you the big acreage. A lot of that is developed already. But in those undeveloped areas, if you find ways to protect them, it might get you, a higher ecological value, 1,000 acres there versus, 10,000 acres somewhere in the arid, West. So I think, it's a good opportunity to also remind, like, there's a qualitative element to this exercise that we can't get swallowed up by the quantitative metric that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've talked a bit about ecosystem services, carbon, species, wetlands, water quality. Is there an opportunity within this administration, as many of us know, when the idea of water quality trading and ecosystem services, frankly, got its start during the Clinton administration and Al Gore reinventing government. And so, is it time that we kind of re-explore those tools and also bring to bear the private sector, the financial sector that can invest in some of these natural systems? And
Brent, let me chime in on that. Very much a centerpiece of a lot of what the Conservancy does. In fact, we have something called NatureVest, which is an impact investing arm that engages with the private sector in innovative financial tools to invest in nature. So for example, you talk about water quality. and water quality trading, we actually are working with investors on investments in water and improved water management in ways that end up generating biodiversity and other benefits, and get a return on investment to boot. That's just one example. But I mentioned earlier Appalachia and those concepts of forest protection and renewable energy investment. There again, working with private investors to actually find economic return and opportunities in those ecosystem services, the carbon benefits, for example, in those forests. I'll mention one final example. There are just so many examples that are brewing and or emerging in the toolkit. And one is we have a program with American Forest Foundation called Family Forest Carbon Partnership or something along those lines. A lot of small forest owners really want and know that their trees can be part of the climate solution. They can enhance carbon sequestration, but there's some upfront costs. It's hard to participate. And so this program actually helps to invest in some of those upfront practices and changes such that they then can engage in carbon markets, for example. So there are a lot of tools and a lot of private investors super interested in some of these tools.
Yeah, I'm glad that Lynn brought up the forest, because I know all three of our organizations are heavily involved in ideas for better forest management in our national forests. And PERC, we released a report called Fixing America's Forests on Monday. And one of the examples we highlight when it comes to finance, when we're thinking about what might count here, we've got 80 million acres of national, forest land that is in jeopardy of, catastrophic wildfire. So how do we better manage the forest? And if we can go in and do forest restoration projects and have forests that sort of check the box on that, like those are the types of things that should probably count towards this goal. One of the programs we've highlighted is something called a forest resiliency bond. And there's a group called Blue Forest that is piloting this out in California at the Tahoe National Forest, where there might not be money up front to go in and do these big forest restorations. So private capital will come in, it'll be backed by insurance companies, other investors, and they will go and do forest projects in a drainage where if there was a catastrophic wildfire, it could impact the drinking water of communities downstream. And the revenue stream, Blue Forest and its investors bring forward the capital and are able to initiate the project, and then they're actually paid back. That bond is paid back by the municipal water authority downstream that's going to get the benefits of having a better managed watershed that won't jeopardize the.
That's a great example. Innovative financing. That's a great example. We have a number of additional questions coming in. Nancy raises the question: what should landowners, rancher-led groups, or other grassroots efforts be doing now to contribute to 30-30 effort and impact what counts? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, and I'm sure others want to jump in. Look, on our rangelands in general, I mean, the lack of investment over decades is catching up with us, right? In terms of productivity, in terms of yield, in terms of habitat quality. And I think one thing that we'd love to work with folks on is really trying to advocate for more funding and more investment into grasslands, and specifically. A lot of our organizations are working on a kind of a NACA equivalent, because we have a great wetlands program. We don't really have anything on the grassland side that would facilitate all kinds of collaboration on our grassland ecosystems, and frankly in our sagebrush ecosystem as well. I mean, there is a level of investment that I think we need that we could leverage many times over. I mean, I think the amount of value that could be created in terms of carbon, in terms of other pieces, but I want to keep people on the land. I mean, I want to keep working lands working, but we need to have better grass. We need to have more resources for eradicating invasives. We need to make sure we're improving soil health in some cases, and we got to have market tools that are sufficient to compete with some of the efforts that kind of plow up every acre for ethanol and other demands on the landscape. So I just can't help myself, Brent. I'm sorry. But I think there's some tools, and I think there's ways to leverage a lot of private capital in some of these, but you're going to need some public investment at least to get the ball rolling. And there's some great tools in the Farm Bill, the Sod Saver program, and the Swamp Buster program. There's different tools that we've all worked on together, but we've never had anything at scale. And so, I mean, I'd encourage folks to to learn more about the North American Grasslands Conservation Act. A lot of our teams are working closely on that. But it's I think there's some tools that we need on the federal side to set up the private conversation, but there's nothing better than having folks that are actually, working on the land already, advocating for those kind of things, because you live it and you know it. And, frankly, that would be incredibly helpful. I mean, welcome the help.
Yeah, I would say also, think about what you as a rancher or farmer needs to keep your working land working at the end of the day. And federal funding might be a solution, but it doesn't have to be the solution for everything. I mean, think about what is hard for you to make ends meet. I know with a lot of ranchers I deal with, not all of them want to participate in a federal program. Sometimes there's a lot of bureaucracy attached to it. It's just not convenient. It's not easy. But, think about regulation, or think about, other burdens out there that can be used, that bring economic value to you at the end of the day, but doesn't necessarily mean a check coming from the government. And I think, at this stage in the game, and I think everybody on the panel agreed, like everything's on the table, like all things are on the table at this point. So again, be creative. Like if the estate tax is an issue for you being able to transfer your land or your ranch to your heirs, talk about that. I mean, think about the things that keep you up at night, because for the most part, the ranchers and farmers are great stewards of our land out there. And it's not about trying to get them to do more. It's not about trying to change their practices. It's to keep them doing what they're doing in order to prevent, it being switched over to development.
Yep.
You okay with that, Collin?
I don't know. When you said regulation, I was like, wait, is PERC actually proposing a new regulation? I choked on myself there for a second. It's like, no. I was waiting for the punchline.
Yeah, the punchline was coming. Yeah.
So I love the focus on collaboration and innovative ideas, more financing, more investment. There is obviously one concern with the focus on fixing climate and obviously reducing fossil fuels or dependency upon fossil fuels. As we know, y'all, most of the conservation efforts and funding in the U.S. right now comes from royalties on oil and gas and federal lands. So, are we going to need to think look at a different approach? Is it time to start, shifting gears? Do you share the concerns that we have at ConservAmerica? Nobody wants to take that.
I'll start. I mean, no, you're right.
Let Brian start, and then I'll disagree.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But Brent, you've got a good point. Critical programs like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the Legacy Restoration Fund, our $20 billion, maintenance backlog on our public lands are coming directly from oil and gas revenues. Right. And I do understand it's a priority of this administration to scale back on fossil fuels, but there are implications for that. And you got to start thinking about what might replace that for revenue for conservation. There's a whole conversation that can be had about outdoor recreation and, how we've got a model, especially when we talk about raw well, we have a model for wildlife conservation that's funded by hunters and anglers in a user pay system. They're directly paying to do that conservation, yet we have a whole other network of outdoor recreation users like hikers and mountain bikers and climbers and skiers that don't direct pay into the system. So this moment of pulling back, potentially on oil and gas could be a way to think about alternate revenue streams here. The other thing I would say is that, when thinking of oil and gas leasing that's going on out there, or leases that already exist, it might surprise some folks to know that PERC is kind of a market-based organization. And we think that the market should be allowed to participate in leasing. So if a conservation organization wanted to bid on an oil and gas lease tract that's in a migratory corridor in order not to extract minerals, and they can outbid oil and gas, they should be allowed to do it. But the rules of the game right now are kind of rigged where it's just the extractive industries get to bid and not conservation groups. And had this kind of reform been in place with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, think about this. At the end of last year, 1 million acres of the refuge goes out to bid. There are bids on 500,000 acres, and it was $14 million. You don't think conservation organizations could have raised $15 million to buy out those tracks and not. I mean, think about how much money all groups have spent over the last 40 years to stop drilling in the Arctic refuge. They could have bidded that out and saved a ton of money in the process.
Interesting point. Collin, do you have response to that?
Yeah,
Brian,
let's John jump in first.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm actually intrigued by the last idea of Brian and I, because right now, if I try to do that, I get carted away to jail for not being a qualified bidder. So I like the idea of not having a record. I mean, I think the only thing I'd argue with is like we have fallen in this trap for I'd argue almost 50 years now, with like conservation needing to pay for itself in a way that other discretionary spending doesn't have to. I mean, we're going to have a defense budget this year at $715 billion, none of which is offset from anything except for tax dollars. Right. And like, if this stuff is, I mean, and this comes from like the Roosevelt tradition of this being as important to national security as anything, kind of our physical security. Like, we have to do a better job in the existing budget. I'm all for user fees and all kinds of mechanisms, but the level of disinvestment we've seen over the last 40 years, where we've gone from well over 2% of the budget, 2.5 to 2.8% of the budget to less than 1%, isn't going to be made up of just user fees. I mean, I can tax every backpack, every pair of boots, every bag of bird seed, every pound of fertilizer, and still not get to the level of investment that I think we need. And this is where I think the infrastructure conversation is interesting. If there's a bigger revenue conversation, who knows if it'd be bipartisan. But I just think at the end of the day, I want to make the case that restoring our national forests is as important to our security as a whole and our public safety as a whole as the next round of whatever's coming off the line of Lockheed. And it's just like we're still fighting for pennies. We're fighting for scraps at the end of the appropriations process. And like, we're $27 trillion in debt right now. Almost none of it is from conservation. Tax cuts, bailouts, foreign spendings, war. I mean, like, you go down the list and like, it's like, these are the things that create jobs. These are things that make us safer. Yeah. These are things that build our economy, and we just don't invest in them at nearly the same scale as we could, or we should.
Yeah, well stated. Lynn?
Yeah, I want to build on the comments that Collin made. There's no single source of funding, and we need public and private and indeed philanthropic funding. But I do want to first really applaud Collin's point about federal spending and the teeny amount that we currently expend on conservation. When I was at the Interior Department, I was always every year in charge of the budget and just chagrined at looking at the tiny amount that was invested. And when I would look at things like the backlog of infrastructure on parks and so forth, these are our nation's treasures, and we need to be valuing in that way and investing in them. So yes, there's federal opportunities. But I also, when you mentioned oil and gas, we need to be reminded that there are some spending buckets already that do not come from oil and gas. So the Farm Bill, $6 billion a year, is actually the largest conservation spending at the federal level. And that is not funded through oil and gas. So I want to remind people of that. But then finally, I want to build on something Collin said about infrastructure. Going back to engineering with nature, natural infrastructure, that $80 billion number that Collin mentioned, if we think about conservation as something else, then it's hard to fund because it's that nice thing somewhere. If we understand that conservation is part of our undergirding infrastructure that enhances economic opportunity, protects communities from coastal storms, can be a solution set for reducing impacts from extreme flooding and so forth, then investing, as we invest in infrastructure, needs to be part of that solution set. And then finally, there is private sector opportunity, and we are seeing that grow. We haven't mentioned it here, but I do want to put it on the table. As we pivot, let's say, away from a fossil fuel economy or a fossil fuel dominated economy, one of the things people talk about is the potential for carbon pricing. Well, carbon pricing would generate billions and billions and billions of dollars, and in fact, significantly more than comes from anywhere from 6 to 20 billion a year that comes from the offshore oil and gas revenues. So, there are a lot of tools. I'm not suggesting that is the tool, but I just suggest that we need to understand there are lots of different mechanisms.
Great points. So this has been a wonderful hour. As we come up on the top of the hour, I want to give each of you just a 30 seconds closing thoughts as the administration, some from the administration are listening on. What advice let me back up. So this can be a resounding success for conservation, as we all know, and I think we're all very excited about that. But we some of us are holding our breath. It'll be either a resounding success or a colossal failure, and I think we're all hoping for the former. So Brian, why don't we start with you? And what, in 30 seconds, what advice would you give the administration as it moves forward?
Yeah, and folks like Robert Bonney know this. Private landowners are going to be the key to making this successful or not. And as everybody said, how you approach and how you engage with private landowners is going to be a huge deal. I think the administration, it would probably not be in their best interest to come out of the gate using what I would call the easy tools, which are like monument designations and bans and things like that. Because I think if you're trying to count on the private landowner at the end of the day, that sends a bad message to the private landowner right out of the chute, because it's kind of that top-down regulatory divisive approach. And then you're going to turn to landowners and say, but we want to cooperate with you, trust us. So that would be my only words going forward. But I think there could be opportunity here for private landowners. So I would not, if I was a landowner, I would look at this as opportunity. So.
Lynn.
In his opening comments, Brian said words matter. And I think we can look to the executive order and the words in there, as he noted, words like conservation, words like collaboration, and suggest that if we embrace those words, we are the solution. That is, if we lean in, private landowners, nonprofit organizations, together with tribes, county governments, cities, we can design this conservation future. So the pen or the keyboard is at our fingertips, and we can help design what this looks like if we really lean in and think about solutions rather than try to emphasize anything we can possibly imagine to critique.
Collin, you have the last word.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm going to build off Lynn's point. I had an old mayor that I worked for 1 million years ago that used to say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That old great cliche. And this is like one of those times, like, you want to be at the table. I would just encourage everyone to lean in, because I do think that it's a big canvas, right? I mean, it's the right words are on the page, I would argue at this point, to tee up the kind of conversation that I think you heard from all 4 of us today. But there's a lot of details to be figured out, and they're going to be, kind of decisions are made by folks that show up. And so I just think, like, the more we're talking about restoration, as opposed to, kind of the protection frame, I think the better off we're going to be. Restoration also means jobs. I mean, we didn't talk about the Civilian Climate Corps and the Civilian Conservation Corps, but, it's obviously near and dear to my heart, but I think it's a huge way to get the next generation of conservationists working in every corner of the country. We can create, we estimate if we spend about $200 billion through the infrastructure package on natural infrastructure, on restoration, reclamation, resilience work, in kind of both terrestrial and marine environments, that we would create about 3.5 million jobs over 5 years. That's not inconsequential. That's a huge number of jobs. And frankly, many of them are in the places that have some of the highest unemployment in the country right now, that are struggling from either commodity prices being down, demand being down, just general challenges to the structure of our economy. And so I would just encourage folks to really think about, like, how do you make it work for your community? How do you make it work for your sector? How do you make it work for your property? Like, what do you need? What are the incentives? What are the tools? I think one of the things that we want to spend a lot of time on working with all of you on is, like, what are those market-based tools to do more private land conservation at scale? Because, like, the land, the traditional tax easement it's just not sufficient. And so whether it's the revenue streams that Lynn's been talking about, all the market mechanisms that Brian's been talking about, we need to figure out a way to make it profitable to conserve and restore, and not simply flip into the next crappy house, development or, subdivision. I've got to stop using adjectives. But the idea is, how do we create a fair fight? Because I do think there's a lot of folks that would love to restore, particularly as the baby boomers are dying out, and intergenerational kind of division of land assets and the like. Like, now is the time, but we need more tools on the private sector side. But that's going to come through real conversations with real private landowners, and not through government alone.
Well, we could continue this great conversation for at least another hour or two. This has been extremely informative. Brian, Lynn, Collin, thank you for your continued leadership. Thank you for your time today, and we'll continue to move forward. So thank you on behalf of ConservAmerica and those who called in, the participants today. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Brent.